The child's lips were already blue, pulse barely detectable. Any rational person would know she was beyond saving. So why did this wanderer risk everything to drag her deeper into the wilderness instead of towards civilization? The wind cut through everything like a knife made of pure hatred. Out here on the frozen plains, late winter didn't mess around. It grabbed you by the throat and reminded you exactly how small you were against the endless white expanse stretching in every direction. A lone rider hunched forward in his saddle, pulling his coat tighter around his chest. Fat lot of good it did. The cold found every gap, every loose thread, every weakness in his defenses. His horse plodded through snow that reached past its knees, each step a monumental effort that sent puffs of steam rising from its nostrils. Then there's the silence. Not the peaceful kind you might expect from a snow-covered landscape. This was the heavy, oppressive quiet that made your ears ring and your mind play tricks on you. Occasionally a distant howl would pierce the airwaves, maybe coyotes, reminding everyone that death was always circling out here in the wilderness. The rider's breath had long since frozen into a crusty layer of ice crystals on his scarf. Every exhale added another layer. By morning, if he lived to see it, the thing would be stiff as a board. Makes sense, right? When temperatures drop below -10 degrees at night, your body becomes a walking steam engine in reverse. Wild West blizzards weren't the romantic winter wonderlands you see in paintings. They were killers. These storms could rage for days, turning the prairie into a white maze where even experienced frontiersmen lost their way and froze to death within sight of their own homes. The smart ones stayed put when the weather turned nasty, but sometimes staying put wasn't an option. This rider had his reasons for being out here, though he kept them to himself. The frontier had a way of making everyone's business everyone else's business, so most folks learned to keep their mouths shut about certain things. His horse knew the way well enough, following some invisible trail that existed more in instinct than reality. The weird part is how your mind starts wandering when you're fighting for survival. Instead of focusing on the immediate danger, thoughts drift to warm fires, hot coffee, maybe a bowl of stew that doesn't taste like leather, and regret. The human brain apparently thinks daydreaming is more important than not dying. Thanks a lot, brain. Every few minutes he'd flex his fingers inside his gloves, making sure they still worked. Frostbite crept up on you like a thief. First you'd lose feeling, then the real damage began. Frontier medicine wasn't exactly sophisticated when it came to treating frozen limbs. Most treatments involved a saw and a bottle of whiskey. The horse suddenly lifted its head, ears pricked forward. Something had caught its attention through the howling wind and driving snow. Animals had better senses than people out here. They could smell danger, hear sounds that human ears missed, feel changes in the weather that meant the difference between life and death. But what the horse sensed wasn't another predator or an approaching storm. It was something far more unexpected and far more dangerous to ignore. A muffled cry cut through the howling wind like a knife through butter. Our wanderer yanked hard on his horse's reins, nearly sliding off the saddle as the animal stumbled to a halt. Was that his imagination playing tricks? Out here the mind could conjure all sorts of sounds when loneliness crept in deep enough. But there it was again, weak, desperate, barely audible above the storm's fury. His eyes swept across the endless white landscape, searching for any sign of life. Nothing but snowdrifts piled high as wagon wheels and ice crystals dancing in the bitter air. Then he spotted it. A tiny hand poking out from beneath a mound of snow near a twisted cottonwood tree. The little fingers were blue-white, motionless as stone. Well, that explained the crying. The wanderer's heart hammered against his ribs as he dismounted. Children exposed to temperatures this brutal could lose consciousness in under an hour. Their small bodies simply couldn't generate enough heat to fight off the cold. He'd seen it happen before during his years on the frontier, and the memory still made his stomach turn. Dropping to his knees beside the drift, he began clawing away chunks of packed snow with his gloved hands. A torn coat emerged first, then a small shoulder. The fabric was soaked through and covered in frost that glittered like broken glass. Whoever this child was, they'd been out here far too long. But here's where things got strange. The wanderer paused, scanning the ground around the drift with the practiced eye of someone who'd tracked both animals and men across these plains. No footprints led to this spot. None at all. The snow showed no signs of disturbance except for the child-shaped depression where the little one lay buried. How does a kid end up in the middle of nowhere without leaving a single trace of how they got there? Makes sense, right? Well, not exactly. The wind picked up again, sending ice needles straight through his coat and into his bones. Questions would have to wait. Hypothermia kicked in when a person's core temperature dropped to 95 degrees or lower, and this child was probably dancing dangerously close to that line already. He dug faster, his breath forming thick clouds that froze instantly in the air. The child's face appeared next, pale as fresh snow but still breathing, thank God. Shallow, rapid breaths that barely moved the small chest. The lips had turned an alarming shade of purple. Then there's the brutal math of frontier survival. Most folks caught in blizzards like this one didn't make it through the night. The cold was merciless, and it didn't care about age or innocence. It took what it wanted. The wanderer scooped the limp form into his arms, feeling how light and fragile the child seemed against his chest. Time was running shorter than daylight in December, and every second counted now. But something told him this mysterious appearance was just the beginning of a much bigger puzzle. The wanderer sat on his horse, staring down at that tiny hand poking through the snow. Steam rose from his breath in thick clouds, his fingers were already going numb inside his gloves, and every second he stayed still meant losing precious body heat. The smart move. Keep riding. Don't look back. Most frontier travelers learned this harsh lesson early. You can't save everyone. The plains were littered with unmarked graves of good Samaritans who tried. Winter didn't care about your moral compass. It killed heroes and villains with equal enthusiasm. Makes sense, right? But here's where frontier psychology gets interesting. These weren't city folk with backup plans and safety nets. Out here, every person you abandoned could have been the difference between life and death someday. That stranger might have known where to find water in a drought, or which berries wouldn't poison you, or how to treat a rattlesnake bite when you're 3 days from the nearest doctor. The wanderer's horse shifted impatiently beneath him, sensing the delay. Animals understood survival better than humans sometimes. They didn't waste energy on moral dilemmas. Yet frontier communities existed precisely because people chose differently than animals would. Then there's the psychological toll. Imagine hearing that muffled cry every night for the rest of your life. Frontier winters were long and dark, giving a man plenty of time to think. Plenty of time for regret to eat away at him like acid. Cowboys and settlers dealt with enough ghosts already without adding another one. The practical side wasn't promising though. His supplies were meant for one person making good time toward town. Adding a half-frozen child meant slower travel, shared rations and double the risk of both of them dying. Basic frontier math suggested this was a losing proposition. Well, except for one thing most people don't realize about frontier survival. Traveling alone was often more dangerous than traveling in groups. Even with a child, 2 people could take turns staying awake to watch for wolves or prairie fires. 2 people could spot landmarks the other missed. And frankly, having someone to talk to kept the mind sharp when hypothermia started making you drowsy and stupid. The wind picked up again, howling across the empty plains like something alive and hungry. The wanderer's horse took an involuntary step backward. That decided it. Whether this bad could kill a healthy adult on horseback. What chance did a child buried in snow have? But the weird part is, frontier records show that rescue attempts in blizzards succeeded more often than you'd expect. Maybe desperation made people smarter. Maybe adrenaline kept them warmer, or maybe the same stubbornness that brought folks west in the first place made them too ornery to die easily. The wanderer swung down from his saddle, boots crunching deep into the drift. His decision was made, but now came the really dangerous part. Getting that child out alive meant he'd have to become something more than just another lone rider fighting the elements. The wanderer's hands burned as he clawed through the icy snow, each scoop feeling like glass shards against his already numb fingers. Time wasn't on their side. The child's body felt like a frozen log when he finally pulled her free, arms and legs stiff as boards. Her lips had turned that dangerous shade of blue that frontier folks knew meant trouble. Wrapping her in his buffalo robe took precious seconds he didn't have. But here's the thing about hypothermia, you can't just throw someone by a fire and hope for the best. That's how people died. The old-timers knew you had to warm a person from the inside out, slow and steady. Too fast, and their heart might just give up entirely. The nearest town sat at least 15 miles away through knee-deep snow. Might as well have been on the moon. His horse snorted and stamped, ice crystals forming around its nostrils. Even the animal knew they were in deep trouble. Then there's the brutal math of winter survival. Carrying extra weight through snowdrifts doubles the energy you burn. More energy means more sweat. More sweat means your clothes freeze to your body, and frozen clothes, well, they'll kill you faster than a rattlesnake bite. The child's tiny hands felt like chunks of ice beneath the buffalo hide. Frostbite had already started its ugly work on her fingertips. He tucked those small hands against his chest, sharing what little warmth his body could spare. His own fingers screamed in protest, but he'd rather lose a digit than watch this kid freeze to death. Every step forward became a battle against the wind that seemed determined to knock them both down. The snow crunched under his boots with that particular sound that meant serious cold, the kind that could snap tree branches and kill cattle where they stood. His breath came in sharp puffs that froze before they could drift away. Makes sense that his thoughts turned to shelter, right? But where do you find protection on a prairie that stretches endlessly in every direction? No convenient caves, no abandoned cabins, just white emptiness and a sky the color of old pewter. The child stirred slightly against his chest, a good sign maybe, or maybe her body was just shutting down piece by piece. Hard to tell when you're not a doctor and the closest medical help is probably playing cards in some saloon 15 miles away. His horse stumbled, throwing both riders forward. The animal's legs shook from exhaustion and cold. Even the toughest frontier horses had their limits, and they were pushing every boundary nature had set. But the weird part is how quiet everything became. No wind howling, no distant animal calls, just the steady crunch of boots in snow, and the sound of two people fighting to stay alive. Sometimes the plains gave you these moments of calm before deciding whether you'd earned the right to see another sunrise. The real test of survival was just beginning. Finding shelter in this frozen wasteland would determine if his desperate rescue attempt meant anything at all. The wanderer knew one thing for certain. Fire meant the difference between life and death out here, but finding dry wood in a blizzard, that's like hunting for a needle in a haystack made of ice. Most folks today think you just grab some branches and strike a match. Well, guess what? When everything's soaked and frozen solid, even the best mountain man becomes a shivering amateur real quick. He scraped together what he could find, mostly sagebrush and dried grass poking through the snow. The old-timers had a saying, burn what you got, not what you want. Prairie grass burns hot but fast. Sage crackles and spits but gives decent heat. Neither lasts long enough to cook a proper meal, but they'll keep your blood from turning to slush. The child lay wrapped in the buffalo robe, still unconscious but breathing steadier now. That was something. The wanderer's hands shook as he struck flint against steel, trying to catch a spark in the tiny pile of tinder he'd managed to scrape up. First attempt failed. Second one too. Makes you appreciate how tough these frontier folks really were, right? Then there's the cruel irony of winter survival. All working hard enough to gather fuel and build shelter made him sweat, and sweat in sub-zero temperatures. That's a death sentence waiting to happen. The moisture freezes against your skin, sucking away precious body heat faster than you can generate it. Many experienced trappers died this way, working themselves into a grave they dug with their own effort. By the third try, a small flame caught hold of the dried grass. The wanderer cupped his hands around it, like he was protecting a newborn baby, because honestly, that's exactly what it was. New life for both of them. He fed it carefully, adding bigger pieces bit by bit, until he had something resembling a real fire. But the weird part is how hunger makes everything worse. An empty stomach can't generate heat properly. It's like trying to run a steam engine without coal. The wanderer had maybe 2 days of jerky left in his pack, and now he had to stretch it between two people. Basic math said they were in trouble. He'd built their makeshift shelter against a fallen log, packing snow around the sides for insulation. Sounds backwards, but snow actually traps air, and creates a barrier against the wind. The trick is keeping the inside just warm enough to stay above freezing without melting your walls. Too hot, and you're sleeping in a puddle. Too cold and you're sleeping forever. The fire threw dancing shadows against their tiny refuge while wind howled outside like an angry wolf pack. Both of them shivered despite the flames, their bodies fighting to maintain core temperature. The child stirred slightly, which gave the wanderer his first real spark of hope since finding that small hand in the snowdrift. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but when dawn finally broke, what they saw through the gap in their shelter would change everything about their desperate race for survival. The first sign wasn't dramatic, just a tiny flutter of eyelids against the firelight. But after hours of watching a child who looked more like a frozen doll than a living person, that small movement hit the wanderer like a lightning bolt. The kid's cheeks, which had been pale as fresh snow, started showing hints of pink. Not much, mind you, but enough to mean blood was flowing again. Breathing came next. Those shallow, barely there breaths began to deepen. Each exhale created small puffs of vapor that the wanderer counted like precious coins. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The rhythm grew stronger with each passing minute, Medical folks today know that younger bodies bounce back faster from extreme cold, assuming you warm them up slowly and steadily, rush the process, and you risk killing them with kindness. The wanderer pulled out his meager food supplies, hard biscuits that could crack teeth and strips of jerky tough as leather boot soles. Frontier meals weren't winning any cooking contests, but they kept people alive. He boiled water in his dented tin cup, softening the jerky into something resembling actual food. The smell of hot broth filled their tiny shelter, and for the first time in hours, hope crept in alongside the warmth. Getting the child to take small sips proved trickier than expected. Those little hands remained stiff and clumsy, fingers moving like wooden sticks. Frostbite damage meant numbness could last for hours, even after circulation returned. Simple tasks became major challenges, but the kid managed a few drops of the warm liquid, and that counted as victory. Then there's the matter of gentle movement. The wanderer helped the child flex fingers and toes, working life back into frozen limbs. Not too fast, not too aggressive, just patient, steady encouragement for muscles that had forgotten how to work properly. Each successful wiggle of toes brought visible relief to both rescuer and rescued. But the real game-changer came with dawn's first light. Through gaps in their makeshift shelter, golden rays began filtering across the snowy landscape. Winter sunrise on the frontier could transform everything in minutes. What looked hopeless in darkness suddenly revealed possibilities. The storm clouds were breaking apart, scattered across the sky like torn fabric. The child's eyes opened fully for the first time, not just flutters or half-conscious glimpses, but genuine awareness. Hot recognition dawned in those young features, along with confusion about this strange man sharing jerky soup in a pile of branches and buffalo hide. Trust would take time, but survival had created an instant bond between them. Weather conditions were improving faster than expected. The wind died down to gentle breezes instead of howling gusts. Snow stopped falling, leaving behind a crystalline landscape that sparkled like diamonds under the morning sun. Travel might actually be possible again. The wanderer studied his young companion, noting stronger color in the face and steadier movements. Recovery was happening, but they weren't out of danger yet. Getting to proper shelter and medical attention remained the priority. Time to test whether both of them could handle the journey ahead. The wanderer knew they couldn't stay in that makeshift shelter forever. Death was still hunting them with every gust of wind, but moving meant risking everything on one desperate gamble. Smart ranchers in the Old West had figured out a clever trick for surviving blizzards. They'd string thick ropes between their house and barn, creating lifelines through the white chaos. Without these guide ropes, farmers would literally get lost walking 20 feet to feed their cattle. The wanderer had spotted one of these rope systems earlier, half buried in snow but still sturdy. Following that rope became their lifeline. The child, still weak but able to walk short distances, gripped the wanderer's coat with tiny fists. Each step forward was a victory against the elements trying to claim them both. Then there's the problem nobody talks about in frontier survival stories. Snow blindness hits fast and brutal. The sun reflecting off endless white creates a torture that feels like hot sand thrown in your eyes. Makes sense, right? The wanderer tore strips from his spare shirt, creating crude eye coverings for both of them. Not perfect protection, but better than going blind miles from safety. The weird part about extreme cold, your body starts lying to you. The child kept insisting they felt warm. Even tried removing the buffalo robe. Classic hypothermia symptom. The wanderer had to stay alert, fighting his own body's deceptions while keeping the kid from making fatal mistakes. Animals appeared first. A few scraggly chickens pecking at something near a snow-covered fence post. Then came the blessed sound of cattle lowing somewhere ahead through the white curtain. Livestock meant shelter, food, and most importantly, people who knew how to survive out here. But why do the hardest moments always come right at the end? The wanderer's horse, faithful companion through miles of frozen hell, suddenly stumbled. The poor animal had given everything, pushing beyond what should have been possible. Many horses didn't survive these brutal frontier winters. Their bones littered the prairie come spring, silent testimony to nature's ruthless power. Walking became the only option. The wanderer helped the child onto his back, feeling the extra weight strain his already exhausted muscles. Every step toward those animal sounds felt like moving through thick mud instead of snow. His legs shook with fatigue, lungs burned from breathing frozen air. Well, desperation makes people do impossible things. The wanderer forced one foot in front of the other, following smoke rising in the distance. Real chimney smoke. not the cruel mirages that sometimes appeared to dying travelers. This smoke smelled like burning wood and hope. The edge of civilization finally emerged through the swirling snow. A few scattered buildings, windows glowing yellow with lamplight. Safety was close enough to touch, but the wanderer's strength was nearly spent. The child had grown silent again, a troubling sign after their brief recovery. What waited for them in that frontier town would determine whether their desperate journey through the frozen wasteland had been worth the risk. The child never spoke about where they came from, not a word. In those days, questions weren't always the first thing on people's minds when someone showed up half frozen. Frontier towns had a simple rule: take care of what's in front of you first, ask questions later. Sometimes much later, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, took one look at the kid and declared them her responsibility. That's how it worked back then. No paperwork, no agencies, no background checks. You saw a need, you filled it. The wanderer watched this happen with something close to amazement. He'd spent so long on his own that he'd forgotten how quickly strangers could become family on the frontier. But here's the thing about rescue stories in small towns: they don't stay quiet. Within a week, every person within 50 miles knew about the mysterious child found in a snowdrift, and the drifter who wouldn't leave them behind. The tale grew with each telling, as stories do. By spring, some versions had the wanderer fighting off wolves. Others claimed the child had been buried for days. The wanderer found this amusing. Mostly, he'd order coffee at the saloon and catch fragments of his own story being told 3 tables over. Well, sort of his story. The version where he single-handedly carried the child through a tornado was particularly creative. What fascinated him more was watching the child adapt. Kids bounce back faster than adults from trauma, but this was something else entirely. Within days they were helping Mrs. Henderson with chores, learning to read from the town's only schoolbook, laughing at the blacksmith's terrible jokes. Resilience like that couldn't be taught. Then there were the practical lessons both of them absorbed without really trying. The wanderer learned that keeping jerky in your inside pocket prevented it from freezing solid. Obvious in hindsight, but frontier survival was full of obvious things nobody thought about until they nearly died. The child discovered that wool socks, even damp ones, could mean the difference between keeping your toes and losing them to frostbite. These weren't dramatic revelations, just small pieces of knowledge that might save your life someday. The kind of information that got passed down through generations of people who lived where nature didn't care about your plans. Years later, both the wanderer and the child would find themselves sharing these lessons with others. The wanderer, still drifting from town to town, would teach desperate travelers about snow shelters and body heat. The child, grown into a capable adult, would become the kind of person others turned to in emergencies. Neither of them ever wanted praise for what happened that winter. The wanderer especially seemed uncomfortable when people called him a hero. He'd just shrug and change the subject. Saving someone wasn't heroic to him. It was just what you did. But the bond forged between them in that frozen wasteland never broke. Even when miles separated them, even when years passed without contact, something connected them. Something that started with a choice made in desperation, would influence both their lives in ways they couldn't predict.